This week's episode of Astonishing Legends is brought to you by Movement Watches, Blue Apron, The Night Call, The Great Courses Plus, and our contributors at patreon.com.
2 weeks ago, we began a series on giants. In that first show, we laid down the groundwork that would point to some of the origins throughout human history that seem to have given birth to the legends and lore surrounding the idea of men and women whose physical stature exceeded the average height of today's people by up to several feet. Did all of these tall ones suffer from medical conditions that lead to unmitigated growth? Or were some of them simply genetically taller than we are today, members of what would now be an extinct species of mankind? Tonight, we will look at that and more as we dive back into the world of giants.
Welcome back to Astonishing Legends. I'm Scott Philbrook, and this is Forrest Burgess.
It was taught by the wise men of the Sioux tribe that the earth was originally peopled by giants, who were fully 3 times the size of modern men. They were so swift and powerful that they could run alongside a buffalo, take the animal under one arm and tear off a leg, and eat it as they ran. Buffalo Bill Cody, from The Last of the Great Scouts, written by Helen Cody Wetmore, and first published in 1899.
Join us tonight for part 2 of our series on giants.
Who's that?
Okay, no. See, the problem here is,
take.
let's just write it. We're never going to make it fit. See, the thing here is, folks, when we do a long quote like that, we're trying to get everything wrapped up by the end of the theme. Sometimes we have to go a little bit further.
Yeah.
I wanted to fit in my...
Boy, it's a good thing I didn't go full Sam Elliott. Yeah.
All right.
Coors commercial.
Let's roll into the next part of the outline.
All
here.
right. And we're back.
That we are. It's been a busy week for us, even though we were actually technically dark last week. We did release a bonus show of an interview we did with Chris Cogswell from the Astonishing Research Corps about his new position as Director of Research at MUFON. So if you skipped that one, you might want to check it out. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was. And it was both comforting and a little strange because we've known Chris for a while now and consider him a good friend and collaborator. But it was also a little weird because although we talked to him briefly on the phone before, we mostly know him through text, our collaboration app, River, and emails, and just mostly I know him from his voice, from listening to him on his own show, the Mad Scientist podcast with Marie Mayhew, who, by the way, is now getting recognized at coffee houses. Yeah.
She's got
freaking her out.
She's got like a debit card that says you must look for the signature or match the signature, so she has to get out her ID, and she got clocked by a barista. Was like, do you listen to a show called Astonishing Legends? And she was like, yeah, why? And he goes, are you the Marie Mayhew or something to that effect?
Right.
She was pretty freaked out. So.
Yeah, I think, then she karate chopped him in the throat and ran out of there. That's how I want to picture it.
She should just have a shirt that says, do not approach.
Well, that's why you got to match the card, because the real Marie Mayhew is quite dangerous on the street.
While we're on the housekeeping, I did also want to take a quick minute to acknowledge the work of one of our unsung heroes here at the show, our editor, Sarah Wendell. For the first, year and a half, back when the show made less sense and the sound design was poorly implemented, I was editing it.
Scott is great at editing picture plus sound, but when it's just sound, yeah.
Anyway, after having been an editor of TV commercials forever and a day already, before we even started this, it didn't take me long to get sick and freaking tired of cutting our show, especially after a long week of research and recording. And I got to tell you, it was just the last thing I wanted to sit down and do.
Yeah, there's really nothing more grating than the sound of listening to your own rambly voice after that, right?
Yeah, thank you for saying my own instead of just mine.
Well, no, it's both of ours, because we have to QC it, and then after that's all done, it's like, I really should listen to these shows. But it's just, I don't like hearing my own voice. You're fine. So.
Well, way back then when I was like, I thought, there must be somebody out there that could cut our show. And I reached out to some people that I used to work with, the former executive producer, who was a good friend of mine. And she recommended Sarah, our editor, and the rest is Hiri. And And the rest is history. Now you can see why we need her.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're not very easy to edit, mind you. Scott frequently forgets what he's talking about, and I can get rambly, sometimes. I mean, not all the time, but believe it or not, I do have an overall idea in my head of the points I'm trying to make. But sometimes it can take a while to get to my point, and then I remember, on the fly, in my head, something I wanted to include, so I try to work that in. I make a little side trip, but I've been getting better at getting back to it because I am conscious that the listener is waiting for me to get to the point, and I'm going to lose them if I don't make the point coherent and understandable, because at the end of the day...
Oh, right. Where was I?
In real life, we're not nearly as smooth as Sarah makes us sound.
That's the truth, and I say all this now because last week's episode was one of the trickier edits. Sarah not only patched it up, she made it flow seamlessly. It was no small task. And by the way, Sarah, thank you very much for cutting this statement about how cool we think you are.
You're welcome. I love doing it.
Yes, thank you. Without you and Tess and Ryan, our sound designer, as well as all the researchers in the Ark, we would be lost at sea like the Mary Celeste. And lastly, this is episode 98 of our show. That's right, 98. Our first show was posted in October of 2014, and time has really flown by since then, I gotta say. At least it feels that way to me, anyway. But after careful consideration, amounting to nearly 10 minutes of uninterrupted thought...
Well, we did get that one phone call.
Thank you. After 5 minutes of uninterrupted thought, we decided that we wanted to do something very special for episode 100 of Astonishing Legends.
Thus, Archapalooza was born. This is going to be a somewhat crazy episode where we're going to have several members of the Astonishing Research Corps, or ARC, on the show for the first time to share their own personal stories, framed by a panel conversation with me and Forrest, as well as Tess and other selected members, which means we'll be keeping the bleep button handy for that one. Right, Sarah?
That's going to be a blast. Well, I mean, for us anyway. Hopefully you guys will like it too.
There's this thing that happens when we do a topic where suddenly it seems like it times out perfectly with news in the world. Have you noticed that, Forrest? You're going to think I'm crazy here, but just
sometimes
run with it. Here.
Okay.
Sometimes we follow stories like we did with the Imminent Disclosure series. That was a follow because the New York Times did that article first, and then we came out talking about it. However, we had mentioned prior, as that article connected, Skinwalker Ranch had been a big series on our show, and that was all connected to Bigelow, and all that stuff preceded that New York Times article by several months, if not up to a year. There's other times when it's even more of a coincidence and it seems crazy. For example, right as we were doing the series on Kelly Hopkinsville, we found out after we'd started it that we were releasing the final part of it 2 days, just 2 days, before the 62nd anniversary of the alien encounter at Kelly Hopkinsville. And this day also happened to be the day of the solar eclipse last year. And on top of that, not only was Kelly Hopkinsville perfectly in the path of the totality, it was the point of greatest eclipse. So I thought it was pretty crazy. Yeah. I'd like to be able to say, as you and I are both producers of the show, I'd like to be like, well, yeah, we timed that show out to perfectly release with the totality of the anniversary. We didn't do that. We just were like, let's do Kelly Hopkinsville. And then poof, part 3 was right on the eclipse.
Well, now that you're mentioning it, that was the most serendipitous, I think, airing and then newsworthiness later on.
Right.
Yeah, so sometimes, as you're saying, something will pop up, and it seems there's a connection there.
This is not as big a story, but I still thought this was interesting. We're doing this show on giants, released almost spastically randomly due to our astonishingly inefficient, haphazard workflow.
Yeah, well.
We're getting better at it. And lo and behold, 6 days after we posted part 1, there's this publicity event in Egypt at the Great Pyramids, no less, where in an effort to drum up flagging tourism for the region, the world's tallest living man at this moment and smallest living woman met.
Yes, of course. They always have to get the tallest person, man or woman, together with the shortest opposite person.
Yeah, this guy, Sultan, he's the tallest guy right now, right?
Exactly. So getting back to this video, and it's very cute. She's from India, I believe.
Yes.
She's featured in American Horror Story.
Yes, she's been on
as
TV.
a character.
Yes,
right,
that's right.
Yeah. But his name is Sultan Kosen, and he's 35 years old, Kurdish, and only one of 10 people in the world in recorded history to measure over 8 feet tall.
That's right. Those people that they've actually measured.
Yeah, exactly.
As opposed to
right.
tall tales or
right.
There's
that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But even in the 20th century here, they're somewhere where they either don't want to be bothered by it or they come in. I think there's one gentleman, he had to go in for a driver's license.
Yeah.
They measured him then, but it's not really that official. So when we talk about, I know Guinness World Records may sound a little bit circusy, but they have very strict measurement standards.
Yes, they do.
And so it has to pass some muster before they will list you in their records.
Yeah.
So if you see a record of something, and it has been verified by the Guinness Book of World Records, you know you can trust it.
It's a very strict standard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So what's the case with Sultan is that he had a tumor that has been removed that caused his gigantism when he was younger.
Right.
However, even after the removal of the tumor, he continued to grow.
Yeah. The tumors are usually on the pituitary gland, and they create excessive growth hormone. And in younger folks, this is manifests as gigantism, and in older folks, it manifests as acromegaly, which has different symptoms. It can still cause increased height, but it also can cause exaggerated facial features and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you could get joint pain, headaches, blurred vision.
Yes.
Really, I think the difference is that when you're still growing, acromegaly happens after the growth plates have sealed over on the ends of your bones.
Yes.
So it's a cartilage growth plate. Basically, you stop growing except that you keep going.
Yeah.
But you're past adolescence and into maturity.
Yeah.
So in your adolescence and youth, it's gigantism.
Exactly, as you would say.
I would say like exactly.
Exactly.
Okay.
The woman who he met in Egypt, the Sultan met in Egypt, her name is Jyoti Amje. Her height, as recorded by the Guinness Book of World Records, is 2 feet and 1 inch. Now, here's another amazing and shocking coincidence.
Yeah.
The difference in height between Jyoti and Sultan is exactly my height of 6 feet 2 inches. How about that?
Well, that's really a stretch.
It's a stretch. That's
That's
not synchronicity.
And really no pun intended there either. And no, you're just fishing for stuff now.
Yeah. Okay, before we move on, I did want to mention a list of some of the more famous giants in human history because we would be remiss if we didn't include them in this series. And I want to start out with Robert Wadlow.
He's always pictured with small people or
Yes.
people in his own family.
Yes.
Just to point out, the difference. People want to see that kind of differentiation.
I grew up obsessed with him because he was the giant in the Guinness Book of World Records. When I was growing up, it was him and Sandy Allen.
Yes, right.
Sandy was 7 foot 7.25 inches.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
They were both in there at the same time, even though Wadlow died much earlier, and we'll talk about him a little bit. But he was 8'11". This was a big man. He's the biggest man in recorded history.
Of the 10, right, I think the top 10 of recorded human beings.
He's number one.
He is number one that we know of. And we might mention here in a minute some of the ones that have been unsubstantiated because what you see when they are throughout history and unsubstantiated, unverified, the heights grow even further.
Yes.
We're talking 9 feet tall now.
Well, yeah, and you find these guys that will refuse to be measured. The ones that are like, when Guinness calls and they're like, yeah, come on over. You can measure me.
Exactly.
And then there's the other ones who are like, I'm sorry, I got to wash my hair. It's not a good day,
right.
whatever. But I'm taller than that guy,
Well, there's what happens in antiquity here, and we're talking 19th century here. I'm looking at Fyodor Machnow of Russia and Belarus. He is reportedly was 9 feet 3 inches tall. Now it's getting even more unusual.
Yeah.
You could say. So John Middleton, the child of Hale, 1578 to 1623, lived to be 45 years old, reportedly 9 feet 3 inches tall.
Right. So, I mean, there's a lot of reasons that doesn't make sense. But, I mean, obviously we can't disinter people, and but he couldn't be measured, and there were no photographs. And on top of that, when you get to that size, you're reaching the limits of what the human body can support.
Yeah, and sometimes they're hard to measure because at these extremes, sometimes there's spinal curvature. That was the case with Zhang Jinlan, who was born in 1964, lived until 1982, unfortunately passed away at 17, but she had spinal curvature and could not stand at full height, I think, towards the end of her life. So sometimes they're hard to measure, but she was the only woman verified to have reached 8 feet tall.
That's the other thing I would say about some of those older cases where they say, 9 feet tall, lived to be 45. Those two as a combination seems unlikely in light of what the body has to do to for you to survive that long. And specifically when we're talking about someone with a rare disorder.
Right.
It's a different idea from the bigger picture of this series on giants in the idea of a species that has grown to that and all the organs are designed for it.
Exactly.
As opposed to
Right.
a person that is having a overproduction of growth hormone.
Right.
Because the amount of work that the heart has to do to pump to a large body like that
Yeah.
is a lot more than a lot of folks can handle. Okay, now you're down to the wire.
You mean like the trendy barbed wire bracelets from Movement with finishes like gold, rose gold, gunmetal, and matte black?
Yeah, I'm getting to that. Please don't skip ahead.
I'm sorry.
What I was trying to say is that you, out there, you're down to the wire on getting a great gift to give for Valentine's Day. But don't worry, Movement Watches is here to help save the day and your night with a beautifully designed custom Valentine's gift box, which perfectly showcases their super stylish watches and their new line of fashion-forward bracelets. Okay, now.
Finally, yes. Like Movement's line of the superbly crafted and sharply styled watches you know them for, they now have a line of cool and classic cuffs, elegant bangles, and trend-setting barbed wire bracelets in finishes like gold, silver, rose gold, gunmetal, and matte black, and they start at just $40.
And of course, they have gift boxes for the guys, too, which feature a classic, solidly built watch and stylish sunglasses, plus an extra interchangeable band, or just the watch and an extra band to go with different looks.
Like the whole collection of Movement items, these bracelets are designed with sleek minimalism, so you guys won't have to worry about going too gaudy, and they're made to pair perfectly with a Movement watch, stacked or on their own.
Yeah, it's a pretty worry-free way to still be a hero for Valentine's Day to your special someone. So just go to mvmt.com/legends and see what we're talking about. And get 15% off today with free shipping and free returns.
Once again, to get 15% off with free shipping and free returns, go to mvmt.com/legends.
Join the movement.
Hey, it's Tess. And when I'm not researching for Astonishing Legends, yeah, I'm still researching for Astonishing Legends. So let's get back to the show.
All right, before we move on from this, I did want to mention Robert Wadlow again, because again, he for me was the iconic giant. And I had the Guinness Book of World Records when I was a kid.
I think
had
we all did.
The
Yeah, a lot of
small
us did.
one that was really thick.
Yeah.
It was like 2.5 inches thick, 3 inches. And it was kind of small and just filled with pictures. And I bought some of the new ones, and they're good, but they don't have that same magic. I gave one to my son. I was like, check this out. But now they've broken them out in all these different little ones. It's like science records, whatever.
Oh,
It's like
I
I
see.
liked the
compendium.
compendium.
Yeah.
I want everything in there. The guy with the crazy fingernails and what were those twins the really heavy twins that rode the teeny tiny motorcycles?
Oh, yes, they were always
the
in there.
McGuire
I
brothers,
think so.
I think they were. Anyway,
Chang and Eng.
here's a story about them.
From your
the
hometown,
original
yeah.
first Siamese twins, not my hometown,
Right.
but they did settle down in North Carolina, in Mount Airy, North Carolina, a very small town. It's actually the town that Andy Griffith named Mayberry after.
That's right. You didn't really see him on a show, though.
No, you didn't see Chang and Ing on the show, but my wife's sister and husband are both Methodist ministers. Although they're not there anymore, for a time they were stationed in Mount Airy. The church that my wife's sister was a minister for, the house, the manse, was a house that had been built by Chang and Ing Bunker.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Their relatives
the
are still
congregation
there.
was all bunkers.
Yeah.
So, and honestly, I would like to go up there and do a show at some point. That's something that's totally doable. It's super fascinating. They have a lot of descendants there. I don't know. I mean, all the things that are difficult to do. Imagine building a house with your Siamese twin.
Well, you got to be very coordinated. Yeah.
Indeed.
Who's holding the nail? I made that joke before.
Yes, that's one of our patented tangents.
Right.
I want to come back to Mr. Wadlow.
Out of the recorded history of the modern era, contemporary history, he stands unchallenged.
Mr. Wadlow does.
8 feet, 10 inches tall.
8 feet, 11.1.
That's right, yes.
He is less than 1 inch shy of 9 feet tall.
Right.
And when you see these pictures of this man, it is just amazing. He was born Robert Pershing Wadlow on February 22nd, 1918. He died in July of 1940. The tallest person in medical history for whom there is irrefutable evidence at 8 feet, 11.1 inches. And I'm taking this from a website called thetallestman.com, which is a really, really amazing website. Whoever has compiled this information, it's very thorough, and it's not just men, it's women as well. It's thetallestman.com. We spent hours there. But Mr. Wadlow is often known as the Alton Giant because he was from Alton, Illinois.
That's right.
I guess when he died, it was in July of 1940, and on the 4th, he had been making a professional appearance at the National Forest Festival, and a faulty brace on his legs, which he had to wear because he was so tall, and it's like we were saying earlier, it's difficult to be that tall, had irritated his ankle, which caused a blister and a subsequent infection. The doctors treated him with a blood transfusion and emergency surgery, but his condition worsened, and on July 15th, he died in his sleep. He was only 22.
Yeah,
and
that's
490 pounds at that point.
Yes, that's really sad because usually people don't live that long.
Yeah.
Sometimes it happens, but it's more often than not they're gone way before their time. In the case of Cecil Bowling, he was born in 1920, lived to the year 2000, to the ripe old age of 79, and he was 7 feet 8 inches. That's kind of an exception in this list of the tallest people. And usually, there's a health problem going on. And not only do you have to deal with these health issues because you're stretching the limit of biology for human beings at this point, there's also tremendous weight involved being that tall.
Right. And again, there's a difference between what the reasons are contributing to your height, because you can be just genetically naturally tall, but you also might be under the influence of a pituitary gland issue or a growth hormone issue.
Right. So it's not unusual to be 300 or 400 pounds.
Yeah. When Wadlow passed away, he was a pretty big deal. He was well liked by the world at large, honestly, and 40,000 people attended his funeral. And he was buried in a half-ton coffin that took 12 pallbearers to carry. And then there was concrete poured on top of that. WhatTheTallestMan.com was saying that it's believed that his family were concerned that, people were going to dig him up and turn his skeleton, try to examine him, and they didn't want that to happen. He apparently had shown no signs of slowing down, even at his death. So he might have gone on to be 9 feet tall had it not been for that infection. It would have been truly amazing. No one has come close to him in terms of documented guys. I do want to mention a few other ones here, and you're going to find out why in a second. Richard Keel, who was Jaws from the James Bond movies. Everybody, he was 7 foot 1.5 inches. Mm-hmm. Although when he got older, he was slightly under 7 feet. I also want to mention Matt McGrory, because he's one of my favorite modern giants. He's since passed away, but he was in the movie Big Fish, which is a great depiction of a folkloric giant. That whole movie is about folklore, and I really love that movie. Matt was actually born in Westchester, PA in 1973. He was 15 pounds and 2 feet long when he was born, and by the time he graduated kindergarten, 5 feet tall.
Wow.
He eventually got to be 7'6", wore size 29 shoes. And this is interesting. He was never tested for any physical abnormalities. I guess that was probably a personal decision on his part. He worked as a bouncer at a bar in his hometown of Westchester, where he became friends, this is again from tallestman.com, with Bam Margera and the rest of the Viva La Bam crew. So McGrory did pass away in August of 2005 out here in Sherman Oaks, not too far from where we're recording.
Yeah.
I guess he was living with his girlfriend at the time. He was 32 years old. He died of heart failure.
There you go. Way too young.
Yeah, way too young. And again, that's a great movie if you haven't seen it, Big Fish. I really loved it. His character in it was very endearing.
Yeah.
There's a few other ones, of course. One of the more famous ones, this guy is the only person ever to have been recorded to have been both a dwarf and a giant. Adam Rayner, born in 1899, died in 1950. He had acromegaly as well. There's Andre the Giant, who I can't remember if we've mentioned yet. Obviously, we're going to talk about him. He was billed in his wrestling days at 7'4", but he actually was apparently around 7 feet tall. And he had acromegaly as well. We got Jorge Gonzalez, who wrestled under the names El Gigante and also under the name Giant Gonzalez. And he passed away in 2010. There's Big Show, 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
And we can't talk about giants without mentioning the consummate giant, Carl Stryken, who is a Dutch actor. He's 7 feet tall, and everyone who's ever seen Twin Peaks or the movie Men in Black or The Addams Family knows who this guy is. He played Lurch in The Addams Family. He plays the giant or the fireman in Twin Peaks, both installments of Twin Peaks. He was Mr. Hom in a famous episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. What I like about Carl Stryken is that we interviewed him.
He'll be happening again here. Yes.
He is going to be on our show, believe it or not. It's pretty amazing. We reached out to him and he said yes, and we have already interviewed him, and we're going to have him in part 3 of our series on giants. So
Yeah,
if you're
super
a fan,
nice guy. Yeah.
he was a lot of fun to talk to, and he had some interesting things to say about actually being a giant.
Yeah, and a lot just about art and,
Yes.
what he's into and what it was like to be on Twin Peaks. So if you're a fan, tune in for that.
Yes, part 3 of our series on giants. Aren't you glad you wrote this one out? Some people probably just skipped it. They were like, giants, what are you talking about?
Let's just go to part 3. I'll skip part 2, go to part 3 and see if there's any interesting
Yeah, now you can just
interviews.
turn this one off.
Yeah, okay.
Well, we do have some more things to say here. I'm sure there are those of you that are wondering about the horned skull we mentioned at the end of part 1, our cliffhanger. We always try to look for something to bring you back.
Did we mention that?
Yeah, we haven't really followed up on that. So let's talk a little bit more about the Spanish Hill Mound.
Well, this is the case which I think sparked this gigantic rabbit hole odyssey that we've been on.
Yeah, I'm still mad at Forrest. Aside from
no,
being
hey.
here in the studio, this is the only place in which I'm speaking to him because
Oh, dear.
he tuned out when we were focusing this. He was like, let's do the skulls with the, and then I got into the river, and then the river went crazy.
Yeah, that's your own
Sorry,
fault.
River. I have to explain what that is. River is an app that we use for the Astonishing Research Corps, and I call it The River, which is dumb, but it's spelled R-Y-V-E-R. So we're all in there. The researchers, everybody's going crazy with all this giant stuff. Like so many, I was like, well, yeah, we can talk about it all. And, cut to, it's, 10 o'clock at night. We've been working on research and an outline for like 5 days. We usually take 2, believe it or not.
Oh.
I know. You can't tell, right? But anyway, and Forrest was like, oh, I didn't mean for it to be all of this.
I didn't. No, stuff was coming in. That's the thing. We have volunteers that'll throw articles in there and
Researchers.
research. Yeah, they do a lot of hard work on their own in their own spare time, and hats off to them.
Yes.
And they'll find a lot of great stuff. My point was that it expanded into all giants.
Yeah.
Everything giant. But this case is one of the more famous ones that initially piqued my curiosity about it all. Because, there's 7 or 8 foot tall people around nowadays, and I'm sure there has been all throughout antiquity. Actually, we're going to find some cases, even in ancient Rome, that's been the case. But ones with horns, matching 2 horns coming out, that gets people's attention. So that's the case, though. This is one of the more famous cases of, let's say, late 19th century burial mounds being disturbed or burial places being disturbed and finding some really long skeletons.
Yeah.
So this one is either called the Tioga Devils or the Tioga Giants or the Spanish Hill Burial Mound Case or the Sayre Case.
Named for Sayre, Pennsylvania. At the time of the find, that was the closest town, right?
Right. It shifted a little. I'll explain that here coming up.
Yeah.
But I'm going to basically read you the little excerpt here or the paragraph that comes from a website, Biblioteca Pleiades.net, and it's a fun site. They're real brief articles on all the stuff that we kind of talk about, and it gets pretty fringy.
Yeah.
It's great fun to read. That's why we love it, and we'll look for bits of information here. But I wanted to recap it with this summation of the story.
Right now, this is from the blog post by Mary Sutherland from 2004, right?
Exactly. So what's interesting here is like a lot of our topics that we do a real deep dive on, you'll wonder about some bits of info. It's like, that can't be real, or is that real? Is that how it was reported back then? And what's stuck now? You'll see what I'm about to read you repeated, cut and pasted over and over again
Copy pasta.
Exactly. into websites now. I can't blame skeptics and critical thinkers who get mad at this because we look at it as fun. We do the research on our own. We make our own observations and judgments, but a lot of times bad information just keeps getting...
It gets cloned and cloned and cloned.
Yeah,
and especially when it's older historically, it's hard to know that it is all based on a real flimsy starting point.
Right. So not to say that Mary Sutherland's reporting here is flimsy, because I think we found...
I'm not saying that.
No. I think what maybe we found, though, where some of these items were picked up, where she got them, and then she does a little, couple of paragraph write-up, and then people start copying, pasting her findings.
Yeah.
Here is the excerpt. And again, I believe she wrote this article in 2004. You can find some of her work on the Burlington National UFO Center website. So it kind of ties in because it's possibly aliens or just something weird and paranormal.
Yeah.
And she's put together a page with some of the more out there thoughts on this about...
on the Spanish Hill Mound.
Not only that, but giants with horns, instances in history and antiquity, the Nephilim, all that kind of good stuff. So that's what we like reading about. But here's her 2 paragraphs. Human skulls with horns were discovered in a burial mound at Sayre, Bradford County, Pennsylvania, in the 1880s. Horny projections extended 2 inches above the eyebrows. and the skeletons were 7 feet tall, but other than that, were anatomically normal. It was estimated that the bodies had been buried around AD 1200. The find was made by a reputable group of antiquarians, including the Pennsylvania state historian and dignitary of the Presbyterian Church, Dr. G.P. Donahue, and 2 professors, A.B. Skinner of the American Investigating Museum and W.K. Moorhead of Phillips Academy, Andover, Massachusetts. The bones were sent to the American Investigating Museum in Philadelphia, where they were later claimed to have been stolen and have never been seen again. So, a couple of things going on there. 2 major ones. One, tall skeletons, 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
Almost to 8, maybe more. Who knows? Another big factor, they have horns.
Yeah.
Okay, that puts a different twist on things, because now you're getting into the, more so into the area of the Bible, and people possibly wanting to prove that antediluvian giants from the Bible, the Nephilim, were in America. Well, somewhere. They have to be somewhere. The point is that they were real. The Bible is real. Especially the Old Testament, where things were even crazier.
The literalists want, it's time to get into it.
Right. And so in the mid to late 19th century, if there's evidence of that, well, there you go. And so much the better for their cause. And how can you refute that? Bones were found. Explain that, Mr. Smarty Pants. So then the idea here is that you're heading from now possibly fantastical beings of antiquity and the Bible to a conspiracy by the academic establishment, or I guess the research establishment, and whoever makes all the history books.
Yeah.
Because they're all going to have to be rewritten now. And so the fact that you're sticking in there that the bones got lost somehow, who knows, but they don't want to have to deal with it, puts a seed in people's minds that really there's a truth out there that they're not wanting us to know.
Yeah, and a lot of people still believe that to this day. Now, these people that are mentioned here in this bio about Skinner, these are real people.
Yeah, exactly. And, they're documented. And there are some things about this passage, you could say, that are real. So I wanted to know where Mary Sutherland got this information. What was her research sources? And that was really hard to do. This whole process, it was funny. Scott earlier was talking about everybody throwing information into the river. And I had that lone question out there like, but what about this Sayre, Pennsylvania thing? And nobody really found much on it because it is kind of hard to find. If you just Google Sayre, Pennsylvania, skeletons and skulls with horns, burial mounds, you're going to get this passage more often than not. This is what's going to come up. Right. So that's interesting. And a picture of a skull with horns on it, with some decorative tchotchkes on it, knickknacks, bric-a-brac. The fact is that picture sticks with you, by the way. It does, because it's really weird. It looks animalistic in a lot of ways.
We've got devilish. It in our shots on the website here.
Yes.
And a link to all the stuff we've been talking about, as usual.
Oh, sure, yeah. And there's one really good website I actually really just started getting into today, actually, doing a deep dive on it. I was kind of skimming it before. I knew it had some interesting info on it. It's one of my 400 tabs that are open. That's a little bit of hyperbole, but not much. And it's called SpanishHill.com, because that is the name of the mound. And it's, I wanted to mention who puts it together. It's Deb Twigg. Uh-huh. She's kind of a local historian and researcher, does some writing, does some presentations on what she's found. I think for decades now, she's been really fascinated by the subject, because it is really fascinating. So she's done a lot of research on this, and she's got a website, her section here, her tab, you could say, on giant skeletons, section number 9, the story and the truth surrounding the horned skeletons, quote unquote. So the paragraph goes on to say, horned skeletons? As you look for more information on Google or on the web in general, you will undoubtedly see stories not only of giant skeletons, but horned skeletons as well, found in our area. I have read where this horned skeleton story immediately hit the wires, quote unquote, and was covered by papers across the nation. And you can click there to see an article from 1916. This is on Deb's website, from a local newspaper concerning the, quote unquote, horned skeletons. Deb goes on to say, it seems that when the newspaper articles died down, the story continued with a life of its own and was included in many books covering the, quote-unquote, strange and unexplained, such as, now this is a passage from Robert R. Lyman, Sr.'s 1971 book, Forbidden Land, Strange Events in the Black Forest, Volume 1. Now this is a quoted passage from the book. Quote, at Tioga Point, on the Murray Farm, a short distance from Sayre in Bradford County, an amazing discovery was made. Dr. G.P. Donahue, state historian, together with Professor A.B. Skinner of the American Investigating Museum and Professor W.K. Moorhead of Phillips Andover Academy, uncovered an Indian mound. They found the bones of 68 men, which were believed to have been buried about the year 1200. The average height of these men was 7 feet, while many were much taller. On some of the skulls, 2 inches above the perfectly formed forehead, were protuberances of bone, evidently horns that had been there since birth. And Teb goes on to say, this story has again surfaced quite heavily on the internet as well, as we've shown and discovered ourselves.
Yes.
Now, there's another instance where Scott has found it occurring in an article or book later. But I think, as far as I can tell, this may be the earliest mention of this, and I think it's from this book, Robert R. Lyman Sr.'s Forbidden Land, Strange Events in a Black Forest.
The question about Robert is, where did he get this information? I did find a website that we visited frequently in the past called Journal of the Bizarre, which is a blog that has a lot of great stuff on it. And I got some information off of that from a 2012 blog entry there that was contributed by Marlon Bressi, who I guess writes for them periodically. I'm not sure if he's still doing that, but the funny thing about it is the article is titled Solved. One of America's most famous unexplained mysteries resolved. And I
actually like resolved better.
Yeah, but they managed to get solved in there twice, really, solved and resolved. And we always joke about that. All due respect to Marlon.
Of course.
We always joke about whenever it's mystery solved, there's often more than meets the eye, but this is a pretty great entry here. He does a great job of tracking the story of the horn skulls.
Yeah.
Back to an origin very close to the one that you found.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Yeah, and this has happened to us so many times. It's like when we did the Jersey Devil or whatever. You start looking at the stories that happened in modern times when there were news sources around or publishing was in play.
Right.
You can't really do this with oral history. But you can start to track where stories started and where they wound up. And it's really one of the most interesting things about our job, I think. I love when you can start to say, oh, look, this one particular fact, it's almost like a fingerprint on a legend.
Sure.
There's this one particular fact, and you look at it and you see that this fingerprint is just everywhere and everywhere. And then eventually what you realize is that it all came down usually to one person who said this one thing that made that fingerprint that then just stays in the story forever. And the more fantastical it is, the more likely it is to have staying power.
Right. Now, I will point out here one counterpoint to the stories. Most of this reportage that people are pointing to, and again, Robert Lyman, he's publishing this in 1971.
Yeah.
I'm going to guess that he's getting his information from a lot of these newspapers.
Well, exactly. And that's something that
era.
Exactly.
You're getting better at it, sure.
And that's something that I want to point to. And here's the reality of this. There's a lot of misinformation about this particular excavation. One thing I did stumble across that I thought was really interesting, and I did want to briefly mention about the mounds and the mound builders, which is it's too big a topic to go into. I mean, it could be years of podcasting, really. And frankly,
it's his own subject.
Yeah, and frankly, it's outside the realm of our expertise. Honestly, that is something that should be undertaken by a Native American historian. But some of the interesting things about the mound builders is, they were sacred sites, oftentimes for burials. Mm-hmm. One of the things that we learned is that they would frequently be reused, and often they might even be reused by different cultures. So on the top, there would be a burial. There would be some bones.
Right.
And archaeologists, or prior to archaeologists, looters would come along.
Yeah, looters, and also the farmers who came in. You got to remember, at the turn of the 19th century, white settlers were coming in and buying up these properties, which before that, of course, Native Americans occupied and lived their lives on and had their own sacred areas, which were not sacred to the white settlers. They came in and it's like, well, I got to clear this land. What's in this mound? I got to move this thing.
Right.
And they would sometimes make discoveries and bungle things and dig up artifacts that should have been left there, but they didn't,
Right. And here's one of the things that's interesting, too, whether it was the farmers or whether it was looters or even ensuing archaeologists when archaeology was still a relatively young field, they wouldn't realize that the bones on the top weren't the only ones there, that they were from a subsequent culture or from so many generations later. And so what would happen is there would be multiple burials up on the mound, and then it would go lower and lower. It's kind of like Greyfriars Kirkyard.
Yeah,
it's just a pile, but obviously a more respected one. That place, the bodies were not respected.
No.
But then in some of these mounds at the bottom, there would be a tomb, a stone room under the mound at the very bottom. And inside this stone room would kind of be the first inhabitants of the mound. And there are stories of large skeletons gathered in a circle around something. There's so many of these. We can't even get into all of them here, but that's what you would find a lot of times at the bottom of the mountain in these excavations. And you can see these images where it's the grass hill on the top. There may have been subsequent burials going up towards the top. And then when you get down to the bottom, there's the stone tomb.
Right. A sepulcher, which is a stone-lined area, which sometimes there'd be a stone slab on the top, rocks piled on top of that with sod.
Yes.
Basically a sacred chamber, you could think of it, instead of like a pine box, which a lot of the, you see in the Westerns. That's what the European Westerners were using. These are more ceremonial. And a lot of times, if you were in a position of power, you had a good spot in there.
What's fascinating to me about Spanish Hill in this particular case, and with these mounds in general, is that the cultures, their tradition was oral, even from culture to culture.
Sure.
There's overlapping tribes in this case that would have been successful or may have died out or moved on, and then other ones come along. But there's still that history where it's like, oh, that's a sacred place. That's where either we don't go there,
right,
or that's where we bury our dead, and it's a very special place. And one of the things that I read in the course of our research, and I can't actually cite this because I can't remember where I read it, but was that the Iroquois, when they were at war with tribes in the area, even they avoided Spanish Hill.
Yeah.
They thought of it as a place that they should not go.
Well, now here's one interesting thing that this is a relevant tangent within this. I didn't know where to put this in the outline.
That's right, folks. We actually have an outline.
There's an outline.
You probably can't believe it.
I am so darn curious to see if any of this is going to make sense.
Yeah.
No, one interesting thing that went along with these newspaper accounts and the local lore and a little bit of embellishment, of course, and an attempt to sell newspapers during an era of yellow journalism, yellow kid journalism, and competing for readership was you throw in a little ghost story. So a lot of these accounts, I believe also in the newspapers, but also that go along in these books and subsequent accounts, is that people were seeing specters, ghostly images of these giants.
Right.
And that adds to the lore because I can personally believe 7 or 8 feet tall people, and then you start adding in ghostly images of ancestors that were, they're doomed to the earth to protect these sites.
Yeah.
You throw those into the local legends and lore, and it really adds something to it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It really spices up the soup.
You give it a wide berth, too.
Exactly. But these aren't just from the turn of the century or ancient Native American lore. Here's something that kind of ties in with that I believe I mentioned in part 1, and this is the Brad Lockwood interview.
Yes.
I think we talked about possibly with Jim Harold.
Right.
But in case I hadn't, again, Brad takes a very logical approach to this subject with a lot of scrutiny but reverence to Native American lore. He has a large Seneca Native American friend that Brad knows.
Yeah.
And he was describing this guy as, he's a giant himself. He's 6'8", 300 pounds, was going to be a professional baseball player at some point. And this friend of his, this athletic guy, afraid of nothing, when he was younger, I think maybe a late teenager, is going home on his 3-wheeler and sees a giant specter or something, a giant running through the woods, keeping up with him.
Yes.
Running through the woods.
This on the Seneca Reservation in western New York, which is where Brad's from.
And, again, he said this guy is a sober individual and swears that he saw this giant running alongside him. Apparently, the Seneca believe there is a giant cannibal who lives on the top of that hill, and he's known as the Protector.
Yeah.
So it's also a way to keep it reverent. So the Seneca don't go up there. That's why he was surprised he even knew about it.
Right.
That's a tie-in, though, with a spectral being a spirit that is associated with these mounds that protect it. And so you see that popping up in these, late 19th century newspaper articles and being carried forth into the legends of today with whites and Native Americans as well.
So coming back around to the facts about this and about Spanish Hill and how the Iroquois avoided it, that there was an oral history there, if that's going on.
Sure.
But with regard to the origins of this story and the horns and the skulls, the primary point about that is that the excavation of the area goes all the way back. The principal moment was an accidental discovery of a skeleton sometime in the 1880s. Which then led to further digging. Now, notedly, one of the additional skeletons that was unearthed was purportedly 7 feet in length and had a much larger than usual, very thick skull that had a receding forehead and a flattened top. These are very specific details, which I thought was interesting. But what about the horns? Well, in the 1916 excavation, which came later at the same area, one of the skeletons was either adorned with antlers or buried under several sets of antlers, and it is thought that this was a chief or a leader, and that's why the antlers were there. The horns were not necessarily growing out of the skull. This idea of these horns apparently got blown out of proportion, and a reader of the Journal of the Bazaar actually sent in images of the original newspaper story from 1916, which talks about the horns, and then 2 days later, there's an answer there from the person that we were talking about at the top of this segment, Allison Skinner. So I just wanted to read a couple of quick excerpts here. You can find this article all over the internet, actually. But in the original paper, and it's hard to find, even though we could find this paper in a lot of different places, we couldn't find what paper it actually appeared in. But we do know it was Wednesday, July 12th, 1916. So this article is titled, Chemung's predecessors, huge giants, were 7 feet tall and had horns. And then the subheading says, one of the most remarkable scientific discoveries in history made here, 68 skeletons of men living 700 years ago, unearthed between Sayre and Waverly. Men were old at 40. They were surprised at the age that they apparently had lived to. And the way that they judged the age was the lack of suture lines in the top of the skull, because those apparently go away after you're 40, which means mine are long gone. And so it was a wet, cold morning when R.H. Lord, who has been employed by Professor Skinner in Indian research work for 6 years, uncovered the earth from one of the Murray Farm graves, and carefully scooping away the soil beside an Indian skull, gave a yell which brought the 15 other members of the party running to the grave. By the way, this behavior is now not allowed by NAGPRA. You do not do this kind of excavation anymore. And if you have any artifacts from something like this, they must be returned and repatriated to the tribe that they belong to.
Yes, it's somebody's ancestors.
Yeah.
So occasionally it happens. You know, I believe the local tribe, whoever claims ownership, may let them do a little bit of carbon dating or something, but then they must be immediately returned.
I don't even,
Maybe not even
the
that.
tribe has to do that themselves.
Yeah.
If they're interested, and in a lot of cases, I think they aren't.
Right.
But anyway, so the 15 other members of the party came running to the grave. "He's got horns," shouted Lord, who talked with an English accent. "He's in league with the devil." He surely had horns, is a subheading under that. And sure enough, he had horns of solid bone, which grew straight out from the skull about 2 inches above the perfectly formed skull, and which gave every evidence of having been there since birth. They were in no way attached to the skull. They were an integral part of it. Then the scientists got out their notebooks and their cameras and searched their vocabulary for words meaningless to laymen, finally hitting upon Pithecanthropus erectus as having just the right swing and describing the horns to a nicety. Mm-hmm. This article goes on. I don't want to go further, but you get the idea for the feel of the article and how it was received. That was published on July 12th of 1916. On July 14th, just 2 days later, a shorter article appeared, written by Allison Skinner. This one I do want to read in full because I want everyone to understand the bigger picture here with regard to Spanish Hill and the horned skulls. This one is titled, Story Exaggerated.
Yeah.
Subheading says, Moorhead Expedition did not find giant skeletons with horns as reported. An article has been going the rounds of the press stating that the Moorhead Expedition, which recently visited Athens and Waverly, had unearthed at Athens giant skeletons with horns protruding from their skulls. Mr. Skinner of the expedition has just sent the following statement to the press stating the true circumstances. The statement follows, quote, "Will you grant me the privilege of correcting the assertions of a news dispatch concerning a find made by our party and the alleged discovery of a mound near Sayre, Pennsylvania, in which the bones of men 7 feet and more in height were unearthed? The dispatch further narrates the astounding fact that on some of the skulls, 2 inches above the perfectly formed forehead, were protuberances of bone, the inference being that these monsters were horned. As a matter of fact, over a month ago, our party excavated an Indian cemetery near Athens, PA, which contained the skeletons of 57 perfectly normal individuals with the usual relics. One of the skeletons was covered by a deposit of deer antlers. Hence, I suppose, the skull with horns on it. This report from Binghamton, coming back a month or more later, furnishes an annoying example of the distortion of ordinary facts when spread by word of mouth, the more remarkable since full and truthful accounts were published by the local Athens paper at the time the find was made. Allison Skinner, Susquehanna River Archaeological Expedition, in camp near Sunbury, PA, July 14th, 1916.
One thing that making Blue Apron has taught me is how to cook chicken and not have it come out dry.
Yeah, I know it sounds simple, but chicken and fish are actually really easy to overcook, as many of us know. But you also don't want it raw.
No.
So is that because you finally got a sense of when things are done and when to flip them, Forrest?
That, sure. But mostly I've learned to just follow the directions and not guess at things. And that's the point with Blue Apron. If you just follow the step-by-step recipes, don't cut corners, set a timer, it's a pretty foolproof way to end up with a really impressive dish every time. I mean, before I would normally cook fairly decent meals for myself, but they just weren't very interesting.
So you weren't making things like strip steak and potatoes with spicy maple collard greens or soy glazed Korean rice cakes with broccoli and soft-boiled eggs?
No. I mean, I can follow a recipe, and I do like to cook, but I wouldn't bother getting all those ingredients just for myself, so mostly I ended up making the same things over and over. But Blue Apron does all that for you, and it does it whenever you want. Blue Apron offers 12 new recipes each week, and customers can pick 2, 3, or 4 recipes based on what best fits their schedule.
And I like that it's all high quality, because they send only non-GMO ingredients and meat with no added hormones, so I can feel good about what I'm giving to my family. Well, if you've been wondering what we've been talking about all this time, here's your chance to try it out for yourself. Because Blue Apron is treating our listeners to $30 off your first order if you visit blueapron.com/astonishing.
That's right. Check out this week's menu and get your $30 off by going to blueapron.com/astonishing.
Blue Apron, a better way to cook.
Forrest and Scott, thank you for supporting their sponsors. I'm Allie. Let's get back to the show.
So now I actually want to refer to a book that we've been using for our research on this episode, Giants on Record, America's Hidden History, Secrets in the Mounds, and the Smithsonian Files. This was written by Jim Vieira and Hugh Newman. And this is from page 171 of the book. However, there is some intrigue to explore first, as there is no mention of a horned skull in any of the archaeological reports from any of the 3 excavators. They are only in the newspaper reports. Professor A.B. Skinner, who was one of the archaeologists conducting the dig, quickly wrote an editorial to the New York Times explaining that not only were all the skeletons of normal size, but that there were deer antlers buried at their heads of the skeletons. Someone in the crowd yelled that they have horns. Here is a corroboration of his exclamation in a later book. This is from a book called Aboriginal Sites in and Near Tioga. While the writer was present, one of the men in working a grave exclaimed, "There are horns over his head." Mr. Skinner said that indicated chieftainship. Later, this was found to be a bundle burial, completely covered with antlers of Virginia deer. A passing visitor, however, heard the exclamation and attempted to verify it by interrogating a fun-loving Maine workman. And the story grew and was printed from coast to coast that one or more of the skulls had been found with horns growing from the forehead.
Right. I have a funny letter. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
That Deb Twigg also has on her SpanishHill.com website. That is actually from Allison Skinner, written to Mrs. Murray. It's from the Tioga Point Museum. But it's a handwritten letter from the Hotel Columbia on their stationery, and it's dated July 18th, 1916, and it goes, "My dear Mrs. Murray, just a line to tell you that the Binghamton Reporter got a hold of our coals." This is in his handwriting, so I have to kind of interpret this. "Got a hold of our coals in the absence of Professor Moorhead and myself. The newspaper account is Maine..." I think this is a term from the turn of the century, Maine Woods Bosch, which I think is poppycock. Yeah. Plus, and there's actually a plus sign here, a secondhand interpretation of our skeleton with the deposit of horns over it, hence a skull with horns on it. He puts an underlines it with an exclamation point. So he's saying, like, look, there's a deposit of horns on it. So, of course, it's a skeleton with horns.
Right.
He's making fun of the guy. So the workman there was ribbing the reporter.
He was messing with him.
He was messing with him. So,
yeah.
And, of course,
it blew up.
It blew up. So basically the letter concludes, all aside, I can't read his writing here, our skeletons were all perfectly normal, but of good... I think basically they're in good condition or of, it's kind of hard to read his writing here, but he signs off Allison Skinner. So that's from the words of the guy himself who was there.
Yeah. Again, right. Saying several times, it sounds like he got so frustrated and he essentially wrote to the New York Times. He wrote the rebuttal. He's writing rebuttals all over the place. He's sending these letters. He's like, no, that's not what happened.
Yeah.
Also, it's his reputation on the line. He's being associated with it.
Yeah. And as we were alluding to earlier, these were real people doing real work because you start to wonder again, we go back to the original entry on this, the one that gets cut and pasted, and you wonder, like, do these people even exist? And so if you do a Google search, they do turn up in the journal, which is called American Anthropologist, subtitle below that new series, Organ of the American Anthropological Association, the Anthropological Society of Washington, and the American Ethnological Society of New York, volume 21, dated 1919. And where these gentlemen are mentioned is a book review, actually a journal review by Donahue and Moorhead by Skinner. So the journal is called, or the first entry is called Susquehanna Archaeological Expedition, Second Report of the Pennsylvania Historical Commission, Harrisburg, 1918. These guys go out in the field. Look, they're not as skilled or as sophisticated, you could say, as our archaeologists are now today, of course, and all the tools they're using and the methodologies they use to really preserve stuff. But it's the turn of the century. They're doing the best they can, but they are very respectful as much as they can, except, of course, they're disturbing Native American burial mounds. But for the tone of the time, they're trying to examine and preserve as best they can and report on it, make observations to the best of their knowledge. And so the report is in two parts, which is being reviewed. The first part being a brief summary of archaeology of the Susquehanna by Warren K. Moorhead. And the second paper is entitled The Susquehanna Archaeological Expedition by the Reverend G.P. Donahue. And the review goes on to kind of say that Mr. Donahue gives some account of the itinerary of the party, but goes further into the theoretical side of the work. The writer has no fault to find with Mr. Donahue's deductions, although he disagrees with some minor details. Mr. Donahue justly remarks in the concluding that, quote, no state in the Union affords a larger field than Pennsylvania for investigation of Aboriginal occupation, and yet less has been done in the state than in almost any other in the entire Union. Your secretary earnestly hopes that the work of this expedition may be only the beginning of such work in this state. So he's saying Pennsylvania is rife with this stuff. We got to get in there, and it's not being explored. And that is exactly the opinion of Allison Skinner. And again, these guys are, nowadays they're probably looked at as maybe, again, not taking the care they should have, but they're respected of the time. So when they come out in a newspaper article saying they discovered something, people are listening.
Yeah.
At least in that community are listening to what they're saying. And that's why the guy's like, no, there's no horns.
There's no horns.
There's antlers. People did not have horns on their head. So he wants to make that clear, again, because these things are ending up in anthropological journals.
Yes.
There's a biography here of Allison Skinner by Terrence Hanley from the blog Tellers of Weird Tales, Artists and Writers in the Unique magazine. He's listed as an ethnologist, lecturer, author, born 1886 in Buffalo, New York, and he died in 1925 in North Dakota, I believe, in a car accident, unfortunately, not that old. I want to point out one little thing here that might have been a mistake early on. At least the bio says, Skinner was associated with 3 museums during his short life: the American Museum of Natural History, circa 1907 to 1915, the Museum of the American Indian, Heye Foundation, Heye. I think it's either Hay or Heya Foundation.
That must be a benefactor or something.
Right. One of his main benefactors to go out and to do these works, these archaeological digs, and collect information and send it back to the museum. And the Public Museum of the City of Milwaukee from 1920 to 1924. Bio goes on to say he carried out extensive research on the Indian tribes in North America, especially the tribes of New York, the Great Lakes region, and the Northern Plains. Skinner also traveled to Costa Rica to study the Indians in that country. The Menominee tribe of Wisconsin was his specialty. A really serious guy.
Yeah, but what's interesting there is those 3 museums that he was associated with.
That's exactly what I was getting to.
Yeah.
Not the Investigating Museum of America or the American Investigative Museum.
When we first read at the top of this segment, when we were talking about the citation that tells the story of Sarah and the discovery of the horned skull, and the one that's been copied over and over and over and cut and pasted in all these books going back to early history, says the American Investigation Museum, which, first of all, would be the worst name for a museum ever. It doesn't make any sense.
Well,
Secondly,
yeah.
it doesn't exist. We can't
No.
find, there is no history of it. We have scoured the world, electronically anyway,
Yeah.
for this museum. It doesn't exist. So I think
That's what
we
threw
talked
us.
about it.
Yeah.
We couldn't find anything on it. The American Investigation Museum. What we think it probably was maybe the American Indian Museum or some other kind of horrible bastardization of one of these three that he actually worked for.
Yeah,
But none of those are in Philadelphia. So the whole part of it where Philadelphia lost the bones, we can't even track that down. There's
a couple of things about that, because then people say, well, then they did find bones, right? Well, yes, but I think as we mentioned in part 1, a lot of these were not in great shape. You'll get bones depending on the conditions of the soil. If it's arid and dry, they dry out, they preserve very well. This is moist ground here. In fact, as Deb Twigg describes Spanish Hill, I want to read this little description of the location for those of the people in that area too. We do have some listeners over there.
Yes, we do.
Spanish Hill, it seems, is actually closer to the community of South Waverly, adjacent and just west of it, and west of the boundaries of Sayre, the city proper, and just south of the New York-Pennsylvania border, from what I could tell looking at a Google satellite map. And Deb Twigg describes it as, Spanish Hill is a huge, lone glacial moraine located in South Waverly, Pennsylvania. It is just 1/4 mile east of the Chemung River, the western branch of the Susquehanna above Tioga Point, and just south of Waverly, New York, and the New York State border. Interesting factor, at one time, it was located within Waverly, New York borders.
I didn't know what a moraine was. I had to look that up. A mass of rocks and sediment carried down and deposited by a glacier, typically as ridges at its edges or extremity.
Now, what's a little different here is that this seems to be mostly nature-made, whereas a lot of the mounds in Ohio, the Adena Mound, the Hopewell Culture Mounds, those are mostly man-made with a lot of effort by ancient peoples in North America, and this seems like to have been a natural feature that was taken advantage of because it's already there. You can see it on a Google satellite map.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool. It's just a natural feature that's like, it's a sacred place because, as we said before, a lot of indigenous peoples will look to what's already there, in nature for something sacred because it stands out to them. It's in their neighborhood. So in summation of that original descriptions in the original paragraph as we read, some of it's true, some of it's a little off, but that gets taken as a whole and gets passed down for all eternity, except for this podcast and a few good websites. And if you read the original books, you'll find where this stuff originates from or follow the trail. But most of us do not have time to do this.
We don't have time to do it.
We had to make time to do that. Because,
we got to make time.
Well, the thing about this is that's the original nut of the story. Is that true? Or were there horned skeletons? I want to know.
Well, but what about the photo? What about that picture that you see on the internet everywhere of that skull with horns coming out of it?
Exactly.
Well, it turns out we're not the first people to wonder about that either. But when you look at it, you think, well, there's that picture. Isn't that the one in the museum? When you look on the internet. By the way, let me tell you something. When you start researching folklore, all you're going to find is wrong pictures with folkloric stories. Right. And even with the world's tallest people, there's a whole bunch where they got the wrong person with the name.
Now nobody's checking that stuff.
No one's checking anything. But here's the interesting thing. In Giants on Record, America's Hidden History, Secrets in the Mounds, and the Smithsonian Files, the Newman and Vieira book that we mentioned before, they were curious about the picture too, and they had a researcher that they collaborated with in the book. His name is Micah Ewers. And Micah and this reporter, I've always wanted to say that. Not a reporter, and it's not old-timey days. But I would like to say Micah and this reporter have exchanged numerous emails about the giants at Castle Now, which is the story that we alluded to in part 1 about a seemingly disparate events of collections of large skulls that might have all been related. And we had said we were going to talk about it in tonight's show, but we found so much more information, we're actually pushing that to part 3. So we're going to talk about that in part 3, along with our interview with the amazing giant from Twin Peaks.
The fireman.
Carl Stryken.
Yes.
But in the meanwhile, Newman and Vieira had asked Micah Ewers, the researcher, to investigate where this picture came from. Listen to this excerpt from their book, Giants on Record. He discovered that the skull was acquired in 1959 by the Cernateum Museum of Supernatural History. Here are the details of the specimen. INV, which I presume means inventory, SDD PE 92464. Exorcist's basket and horned human skull. Acquired by the Cernateum in 1959. Origin, France, between 1920 and 1940. It was looked at in detail by their experts who tantalizingly concluded, quote, although we thought that the object had been cleverly manufactured, an analysis has demonstrated that the horns are genuinely part of the skull. An in-depth examination and x-rays leave no room for doubt. The skull is not a forgery.
What?
We followed up, that's an end quote, we followed up by writing to the curator of the museum who contradicted what was written on the website. He said, quote, "The horn skull is a skull made for a cult to Pan during the 17th century, Painswick. It's perfectly made, but I don't believe in the existence of horned humans, so it's certainly a fake, but a real cult object," in parentheses. So, whether this skull is genuine or not remains to be seen, but no matter what, and this is what they say in the book, Giants on Record, it certainly has no connection to the Sayre story or the Spanish Hill story.
Okay, we cleared that up.
We did clear it up, sort of. It's funny, when I started reading this, I thought it was going to totally... I looked at this a few hours ago, and I was like, oh, they're going to say that it's a fake skull. And it's like, actually, no, it doesn't say that. They don't know what it is, but it's not related to Spanish Hill.
Okay, let me clear this up then, just sitting here, because I skimmed over that, in all the materials. I think when you first discovered it, it was like, I can't wrap my head around that. Let's just file that away until we get closer to the recording time. Yeah. And so what I'm asking you now, it's obviously used, or what is believed to have been used as a ceremonial mask, right?
No, it was more of a cult object.
Okay, different.
It's not something you can put on.
Okay, gotcha. Because the reason I say that is one of the theories nowadays of people trying to make rational sense of anything horned or something or unusual, is that people at the time mistook ceremonial masks for real bone.
Yes.
So what I'm asking you, though, is that when you say cult object, of course, people, they steal it, they put it in their basement or wherever, they squirrel it away, and somebody's doing weird stuff with it during their pizza parties, in the basement. So what you're saying is that this thing is really bone, all bone? This is a real
that's
object?
What it says on their website. But this is the thing I can't figure out about them. And I have not had the chance to ask Micah Ewers this. I'm going to email him and ask him this question. He tends to get back to me very quickly. Yeah. What he found was that it was acquired by that museum in 1959. When I looked up that place, the Cernateum, I found a website. And that skull's on there, along with a lot of other creepy, cool, cultish stuff. Wow. It's like right up our listeners' alley. They would love it. It's a neat website. We have a link to it in the show notes. However, I expected that if it was acquiring objects in 1959, that it must have been a collection on display at some point.
Sure.
From looking at the website, I could not deduce that it ever was a brick and mortar situation. So it's not clear to me really what's going on here, because if you're acquiring things in 1959, are you still around to build websites in 2018 and not have a museum of some kind? There's something fishy about the whole thing.
Okay, so what you're saying is that somebody took a photograph of it from...
No, they're saying they have it.
They have it.
That it's a cult object from France.
Right. But you don't know...
We are from France.
There's a Conehead thing coming up here later.
Yeah, exactly.
Stay tuned for that. What you're not certain of is what institution or organization
I don't understand this
holding
museum.
It. Yeah, I get you. Okay,
and they had competing descriptions of it.
Right.
They had a description of it on the website that was then contradicted when they were contacted directly about it.
Oh, that's strange, yeah. This is the bigger, fringy argument, because now we're getting into the real controversial elements of this. And there is definitely controversy out there, because there are people writing books that they're purporting that strange creatures do exist from antiquity. And some even claim they're coming back. So get ready for that. And of course, the researchers and writers who just say, just stop wasting your time with this stuff. This stuff does not exist. There's no proof of it at all. Well, if you have an item that could be analyzed and it's solid bone and it's, that can be determined, I'm pretty sure. You can carbon date anything organic. So you can find out the age of it. An expert could tell if this is a real skull with horns. Now, unlike the pictures that we were talking about earlier, I think we didn't really need to go into it, because there are people with horns, but there are growths of keratin essentially gone wild, cells mutating. And so you'll see a picture of an older lady or usually an older gentleman. It takes a while for these things to grow with something coming out of their face. Yeah. But it's not a matching pair of horns that are symmetrical, exactly 2 inches above the eye sockets, placed decoratively, we could say, that are natural. Protuberances of bone. That does not seem to happen. If you could produce something like that, then people are going to argue that, hey, giants of yore and possibly stuff from the Old Testament is real. We're just now describing it, and people are actively trying to keep that from you. So that might be a bona fide conspiracy. what you're telling me then, there's no real horned skulls we can point to.
Yes, and on top of that, in this case, in the Spanish Hill case, there are no horned skulls. There is that weird one that belongs to that weird museum.
Yeah, well...
that website is even weirder upon further inspection, which we just took a little break here. I can't tell what's really going on there.
Yeah.
And then it seems fictionalized, the website. But they have the picture of the skull with the horns, which makes it all even stranger. But they seem to go out of their way to make it clear that it's not connected to Pennsylvania.
Yeah. I think because that's the only case that we've come across so far where it explicitly mentions horned skulls.
Right, which is really a tangential find to the overall nature of this arc of our series.
Right. So here's what's interesting about all that is that it's not just white Europeans having these ideas of giants, certainly bringing them over from the Middle Ages into North America. Of course, the Native Americans had their own legends. They had their own giants. And it's not like the Europeans brought those over to them. So let's take a look at what the Native Americans thought and what are some of their earliest legends about giants.
Well, here's an interesting thing about the Sioux tribe that I thought was really fascinating. And this comes from a book by Helen Cody Wetmore about her relative, Buffalo Bill Cody, which I think this is pretty fascinating. I'm going to read this excerpt from page 135 of that book. It was actually first published in 1899. During the scouting expedition that followed, the party chanced upon an enormous bone, which the surgeon pronounced the femur of a human body. Will, which is what she calls Buffalo Bill in this book, understood the Indian tongues well enough to be in part possession of their traditions, and he related the Sioux legend of the flood. It was taught by the wise men of this tribe that the earth was originally peopled by giants, who were fully 3 times the size of modern men. They were so swift and powerful that they could run alongside a buffalo, take the animal under one arm, and tear off a leg and eat it as they ran. So vainglorious were they, because of their size and strength, that they denied the existence of a creator. When it lighted, they proclaimed their superiority to the lightning. When it thundered, they laughed. This displeased the Great Spirit, and to rebuke their arrogance, he sent a great rain upon the earth. The valleys filled with water, and the giants retreated to the hills. The water crept up the hills, and the giants sought safety on the highest mountains. Still, the rain continued, the waters rose, and the giants, having no further refuge, were drowned. So, here we've got this creation myth. Now, we're relaying a version of it that's being told by a white man.
Right. Well, that's true.
Yeah, and I want to go ahead and acknowledge that. But according to Buffalo Bill, this is part of the Sioux's origin story.
Right.
And we all know, historically, there have been indications that a great flood is part of the origin story of multiple cultures throughout the world. But this is fascinating because this predates their exposure to Christianity.
Right.
Theoretically.
Yes, exactly. And we didn't have time to really get to the origin story of this origin story.
Right.
The idea is interesting because, of course, what does it sound like? It sounds like the Old Testament and the Nephilim. You had a race of super beings that defied and angered the creator, the one true creator. But there were still these powerful beings, and it's like, guess what? You guys have done enough down here. I am going to wipe you off the face of the earth because this is not your domain. You're not being cool. So, of course, there's a lot of tie-ins with the Old Testament. Who knows? I mean, that's what's fascinating. Who knows where they got that? However, we discussed flood myth before, I believe, with the southwestern Native American peoples. And was it the Pima?
Yes.
You remember the ball of tar, which the man and the woman, as a ball of twigs, I think that they coated with tar, and they had some animals with them, but this ball of tar floated and kept them safe.
Right.
And when the waters subsided, they repopulated again.
That's exactly right.
That is not
exactly
Buffalo
right.
Bill. That is not Buffalo Bill. That's actually coming from the oral traditions.
Yeah, that's true.
Of the Native Americans. I think it was the Pima. That would be then maybe Arizona or southwestern Arizona. So these crop up everywhere. That's just so fascinating. And then you wonder again, if there hasn't been contact, the idea of big humans, as I said at the start of part 1, it's not such a stretch. We can all imagine great versions of ourselves that are bigger, stronger. That certainly has happened since there's been humans. There's always been a mutation here and there, a pituitary gland going haywire, so you get an extra large version, and it's like you either revere this person. It's like, you're going to protect us, right? Because we're
Right.
all 5'5". You're inching up on 7 feet, and here's a club. Just go out there and battle the enemy first. We'll be right behind you.
Yeah.
And so we revere them, but also on the other hand, if they're horrible, we fear them and they must be destroyed. So what we're seeing here is, and again, if this is true, if Buffalo Bill got this pretty good translation from the Sioux, it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, and I was able to look actually just a few minutes ago, and I did determine that it's not the same origin story for them. You know, there's the
Right,
creation
sure.
myth, and there's other stories as well, but there is a flood myth present among varying Sioux tribes
Oh, that's interesting.
that I could confirm just
But this
now.
one definitely deals with, though, is terrible giants.
Yeah, that one does.
Yeah.
I mean, that one that Buffalo Bill is reporting deals with giants, yeah.
Well, anyway, that's an interesting look at Native American legends, which I personally love. I love hearing about them.
It's an interesting thing to me.
Well, we do
with
live
the
in America.
folklore.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do live in America,
Yeah.
but a lot of the stories that we cover, that's where it comes back to. It comes back to Native American lore and at its ultimate root.
Yes, it's not an invention of the white man. They have certainly their own tales of giants and all kinds of supernatural beings way before anybody got here. But what happens when the white man first gets here? What are they seeing? So there's good evidence, though, that the first explorers that show up and the first colonizers that come to America, post-Columbian here, post-Columbus, they have had some recorded interesting encounters with, let's just say, larger than average Native American tribes
Yeah.
and Native Americans themselves.
Have you been waiting for a podcast as vast as space and as timeless as infinity?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that sounds pretty
A
intriguing.
podcast that's the meeting place between alien documentaries and Frasier?
Well, I do like both of those things.
Then a brand new podcast from Audio Boom called Night Call is just what you've been waiting for.
Go on.
Grantland alumni Molly Lambert, Tess Lynch, and Emily Yoshida bring you a weekly podcast to keep you company during lonely nights and strange days.
Sure, I could use some company.
Between breaking pop culture news and wait, how did Molly think Billy Joel was Italian?
Well, I could see how someone could think that, I mean, Long Island, scenes from an Italian restaurant and all, but I think he's Jewish.
Every Monday, Night Call's bi-coastal hosts sit down for a free jazz blend of pop culture, internet culture, and just enough half-baked conspiracies to keep things interesting.
You've piqued my curiosity, sir.
Drop them a line with your Night Call at 24046-NIGHT.
You mean I can call them on the phone, like using my voice for a voice call?
Yes, like with your voice, over the telephone, or at least leave them a message and they'll get back to you. So call 24046-NIGHT, and they'll offer their best advice on life, love, and the coming apocalypse.
Okay, good. I could use help with all three of those things.
Night Call is available now on Apple Podcasts and all other listening destinations. What are you doing? Put the phone down.
Oh.
We got to finish the show.
Sorry. I'm willing to bet there's a connection between our series on giants and this latest course over at the Great Courses Plus, Origins of Ancient Great Civilizations. Am I right?
Yeah, there is, sorta.
I knew it, see? Everything is sorta connected. All right, well then what's the connection?
Well, this lecture series is all about the cradles of civilization, mainly around the three river systems in the present-day Middle East, the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Nile, and one of the earliest literate urban cradles to rise up from Neolithic village culture into something resembling a city was Uruk around 3500 BC, in the region of Sumer in Mesopotamia, or southern Iraq today.
Uruk, hometown to our homeboy, Gilgamesh. He's been organically coming up a lot lately.
Yeah, that's a little weird.
Yeah.
But around 5000 BC, people started moving into the river valleys in Mesopotamia, which were subject to unpredictable and repeated flooding, and early stories of the flood made their way into the mythology and eventually into the Epic of Gilgamesh, the giant hero during the Uruk period, 3500 to 3100 BC.
Yeah, I'm waiting for you to start getting into ancient alien territory here. Zechariah Sitchin, the Anunnaki, planet Nibiru, Enlil, Enki, the good stuff.
Yeah, this course ain't going there, and neither are we for the moment.
Oh.
But Enki is the god of waters in Mesopotamian mythology, or the Sumerian god of sweet waters. He's benevolent to mankind, but he's always tricky. And there's that trickster element again, because he's unpredictable like the flooding waters. So Enki, you could say, represents in mythology the waters that nourish us, but we must also be wary of their fickle, violent wrath, just like the giant heroes of antiquity.
Oh, nice summation there, Professor Philbrook. Well, if you want to sound as erudite as Scott here, on probably any subject you can think of, use our special URL for unlimited access to sample over a now whopping 9,000 courses with a free trial of the Great Courses Plus.
Start exploring today. Sign up at thegreatcoursesplus.com/legends.
Remember, that's thegreatcoursesplus.com/legends.
Hey, it's Tess. This one time, I emailed listener seguesal@gmail.com, and all I got was this segue. Come on. All right, back to the show.
So now getting back to Deb Twig's Spanish Hill website, which is, again, a lot of great information. It's a lot of fun to dig through. She actually gives talks, as I mentioned earlier, presentations of her findings and her research here. And so she has one about the Carnatuan culture and Susquehannock tribes of the area, which she, I think, presents at the Susquehanna River Archaeological Center. There's some YouTube video. I think it's her. You can actually see her giving the presentation, and it's pretty interesting because she, at least the clip she presents, starts off with the tale of Captain John Smith. And as you may know, if you don't know, we have a lot of international listeners. But Captain John Smith was an English soldier, baptized January 6th, 1580, and lived to June 21st, 1631. And he was an English explorer, colonial governor, admiral of New England. He was also an author, so he was used to writing journals and played a very important role in the establishment and leadership of the Jamestown colony here in America, which was the first permanent English settlement in North America. And without his leadership, the whole thing probably would have fallen apart.
Yeah.
He was the one, I think he borrowed it from the Bible. He said, if you don't work, you ain't going to eat.
Right.
So you are going to work if you're going to get food here. So just a kind of a fearless explorer. And he first encounters the Native Americans of this area. Now, according to Deb's, I'm calling her Deb like I know her, but I wish I knew her. She's very interesting. According to her presentation, this group was called the Andaste. And according to Captain John Smith in 1608, I think that's the time when he encountered them, he describes them as being very similar in dress and appearance and hairstyle to the Huron. And the French missionaries use the word Andastes, or Andastes, to describe them. What I like here is that they were said to be the only tribe the Iroquois ever feared.
Oh.
So they're big and they're mean, of course, until the Iroquois acquired guns, and then I think they helped wipe them out.
Yeah.
Because the gun is the thing that makes all men equal in a way, unfortunately. In this sense, you can be small, and you can go up against a giant, and like David and Goliath, if you have a better tool, like a sling with a rock in it, or a musket, you're going to win.
Can I just make a quick aside about the Andaste? There was an SS Andaste.
Oh.
Was a bulk Great Lakes cargo vessel, steel-made, built in 1892 for the Lake Superior Iron Company. It sank on Lake Michigan on the night of September 9th in 1929 with all hands aboard. 25 men were lost. It has still not been found. So
That's another mystery.
Little unsolved mystery there and within the mystery.
Yeah. Not crewed by giants, though.
No, not crewed by giants, as far as we know.
Okay, but the name, they've obviously
Named it after the tribe.
I see. Okay. Well, the first known reference that we know of comes from a reference in the memoir, The Voyages of Captain John Smith, 1607 to 1609. He's the first one to really write about these people to the English, telling about his encounter here with these giant warriors called the Susquehannocks. And he writes in his first encounter here, and again, I believe this is from the journal, but I'm also taking it from SpanishHill.com. Quote, 60 of those Susquehannocks came to us. Such great and well-proportioned men are seldom seen, for they seem like giants to the English. Lifting that quote there, that he was definitely impressed with the visual sight of them, but also the sound of them, because he said their voices to him sounded like they were, quote, coming from a vault. You know what I'm saying? That deep, much better than the giant voice I led off part one with. It was just like a deep, resonant voice. Another thing he describes, like giant limbs on these people. I'm not sure about this, but this is how he wrote it. I think one of the leaders comes up to him, one of the 5 leaders of the tribe there come up to him, and he said the biggest one, or one of the most impressive ones of these guys, the calf of whose leg was 3/4 of a yard around.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, is that long or
I don't
all the way
know.
to the circumference of that? So that's interesting. Basically, they're huge is what he's saying.
Yeah.
So Captain John Smith decided it would be best to leave them alone. And
Right.
he turned and he promptly left them. And as I think if you see the map that he created, because he also mapped a lot of the coastal territories, I think, he led an expedition along the rivers of Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay. He was the first English explorer to map the Chesapeake Bay area and also the coast of New England.
Oh, well, there you go.
There you go. He's up. Yeah, I make maps.
Yeah.
He's certainly used to rough conditions, but the sight of these folks scared the crap out of him. So, I think what you see on the map that he made, like that area, unexplored.
Right.
Someone else is going to do it. I'm sure he'll be fine.
There'll be monsters there.
Yeah, I don't want to be the guy to have to do that. So here's something interesting as we continue here. Several of the Susquehanna or Undaste remains found in Athens, Pennsylvania, were said to be between 6 and 7 feet tall. The average height of the Undaste, according to the Spanish Hill website by Deb Twig, was around 5 and 6 feet, with some exceptional individuals. So around 6 to 7 feet, like maybe the chiefs or the Werowantses, the 5 chiefs that came to greet Smith, they may have been slightly taller than the average.
Right.
And so even the average Undaste was probably a foot taller than the average European who encountered them at the time.
Right.
Because back then, the average height for a European in the Middle Ages, let's say the 1600s, about 1608 to 1609, the average height was about 4'10", 4'11". I know that's pretty short, but going into 5.5 feet, that's average. Now, some of the English kings were even much taller. I'll have a little factoid about that later, but the average person with the average nutrition in Europe, 5.5 feet. And so now they're meeting people that are 6, maybe 6.5 feet.
Yes.
Makes an impression on you. And here's my point. Think about how you see contemporary people today. If you think about a foot as a unit of measure, it's not that long. It's not like a yard. A meter is about 3.28 feet. It's just a foot. But the way we think about it as a measurement of height, think about meeting somebody who's 5 feet tall. Picture that in your mind. Now picture somebody you meet who's 6 feet tall. Like, big difference. That starts to get tall.
Yeah.
And then think about meeting somebody who is maybe 7 feet tall. Carl Stryken.
Yeah.
That makes a huge impression, just a foot of height. It's not that common, but imagine now somebody who may be even 8 feet tall. And that is very rare, but it does happen. That now really gets your attention.
Yes.
That's a giant. So a lot of this talk that we're discussing here comes down to what you think a giant is.
It's subjective and based on your personal height
Yeah,
relative to this person who's larger than you.
Exactly. So think about somebody, this is funny, in a relationship, think about somebody who's wooing you, and maybe if you're the woman and you see a guy who's 5'5", unless you're Tom Cruise, maybe that's not your thing. And a guy who's 6 foot, that's not a lot of inches, but that makes a big difference personally to how you view them. And the same thing for men looking at women. It's like a woman who's in 5'1" to 5'5". Well, that's about normal for America. A woman who's 6 feet or taller, then you're thinking like, wow, if she puts on heels, am I going to look like a shrimp? So, these things are considered. So it's a very personal thing. So that's the point I'm trying to make is when you first see somebody and it's a tribe of very foreign-looking people to you that seem big, you're going to remember it. And I believe that's what's happening here with Captain John Smith. It has a lot to do with perception. Okay, so now going back to Deb Twig's SpanishHill.com website, in her attempt to frame the argument here about what's actually been found as far as giant skeletons are concerned, item number 6 here comes from the publication Pennsylvania Archaeologist, Volume 61, Number 2, September 1991, and it's an excerpt from an entry by Dr. Marshall Becker. And Marshall Joseph Becker, Ph.D., is an SRAC advisory board member and a senior fellow in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. I love this part because it sounds very academic, the abstract. So here's the paragraph that follows that. When John Smith first contacted a group of Susquehanna in 1608, he described these people as giant-like, quote unquote. Direct communication of this observation can now be provided through the studies of the long bones of a population which was part of the Susquehanna, quote, confederacy, unquote. Recent excavations at a Susquehannock site on the south branch of the Potomac River in Hampshire County, West Virginia, revealed portions of a palisaded village and associated features dating back to the middle of the 16th century. This remnant of a flood-destroyed site yielded 13 relatively intact burials. Surface collection of skeletal material immediately downstream of the site after the flood provided long bones from at least 18 other adults. Calculation of the stature of the individuals presented in this sample and comparisons with other Native American populations of this period confirm John Smith's observations. So
that's
there you go.
fascinating. Collaboration right there.
This guy knows his stuff. So what he's saying is that large skeletons are being found. We're not saying giant because, again, that can be a loaded term and it's very subjective. But what seems evident, even by today's standards, is that large skeletons have been found.
Exactly. And before we move on, I do want to talk about the stonecoats, which is pretty fascinating. This comes from a website called native-languages.org/stonecoat. Stonecoat is the name of a mythological rock giant of the Iroquois-speaking tribes. In some tribal traditions, there is only one stonecoat, while in others, there is a whole race of them. Stonecoats are described as being about twice as tall as humans, with their bodies covered in rock-hard scales that repel all normal weapons. They are associated with winter and ice, and they hunt and eat humans. In some legends, stonecoats were once human and became cannibal monsters as a curse punishing them for evil deeds, like the Wendigos of Chippewa mythology. In other legends, stonecoats were never human, but were a tribe of primordial, man-eating monsters created by Flint. Now, I had to look up who Flint was. This is also from the same website, just for a little background. In many Iroquoian and some Algonquin legends, the culture hero has a twin brother or younger brother named Flint, who killed their mother in childbirth, usually by intentionally cutting his way out rather than waiting to be born. In Iroquois stories, this spirit is often malevolent and goes on to create hardships for humans and fight with his brother. In Algonquin legends, the character of Flint does not generally commit any further crimes or problems other than the death of his mother. In many tribes, Flint is associated with winter, night, and death. And so what's interesting about this to me is that Flint is this guy who doesn't have the best reputation. In one culture he does, in the other it's not great but better. But either way, he's created these stonecoats and these giants, and it's super fascinating because they're twice as tall as a man and their bodies are covered in rock-hard scales that repel all normal weapons.
Yeah, very Lord of the Rings here.
It is. Yeah. Are they reptilian? Is it steel? Are they really made of rock? I can't help but think of, in the back of my mind, there's not going to be a lot of people that are going to remember this, but in the old Star Trek, they go to that one planet and this big pile of rocks.
Oh, the rock monster?
Yeah, and it's got the two red eyes. That thing creeped me out.
Right. Well, the idea here is that it's kind of supernatural because rock is not malleable unless you're chipping it for flint tools, so that you could make a knife or hammers or axes.
Call back to Flint there.
Yes, that's exactly what it reminded me of, Flint and its importance to native peoples and Neolithic villages of antiquity, always. But what's interesting is the visual aspect. Myths a lot of times start off with things that people see that they can't explain, or you create a myth to explain things you don't know anything about, like where does the thunder come from? Who makes the lightning?
Yeah.
Why is it flooding here? Well, these are all myths that explain our creation, of course. But in this case, what's interesting is that these stonecoats or stone giants, it's kind of the armor and the cannibalism and the connection to winter and death and misery for human beings that are usually nice is mythic. So in a note here that Tess has put forward in her further research on this stone giants or stone coats.
Yeah, this is, by the way,
article.
this is excerpted from Annual Report, Volume 32 by the Smithsonian Institution, Bureau of American Ethnology by John Wesley Powell, Matthew Williams, Sterling, Frederick Webb Hodge, Jesse Walter Fox, and William Henry Holmes. And this is on page 64 from the section called Seneca Fiction, Legends, and Myths.
So this is quoting from the book now. In the Curtin collection, there are 8 stories which refer to the Gononsgwa, or stonecoats, sometimes called stone giants, but there is nothing in them to connect these peculiar fictitious monsters with the original conception. In none are the operations of the winter process predicated of these fictitious beings. They are merely exaggerated human figures and not symbols of a process of nature. Their deeds are the deeds of men and are not the acts of a process of nature expressed in terms of human activity. And thus is founded the race of the stone giants or stonecoats, or more popularly, the giants. When once these fictitious beings were regarded as human monsters, they soon become confused with cruel hermits and bloodthirsty sorcerers who, because of evil tastes, were cannibals and dwelt apart from the habitations of man, who shunned and feared them, and the tales about them became narratives that do not detail the activities of the winter god, the personified process of nature, and so, like with their human prototypes, they increased and multiplied mightily, and so were as numerous as the leaves in the trees. So I think the idea here, why Tess highlighted this section, this is not so much allegory, but describing the acts of humans, bad, evil people that have become legendary and have worked their way into myth and legend. You know what I'm saying? Rather than something being legendary, it's like, well, the beaver brings the sun. Or I just remember the old one. I can't remember what. That's what I was taught when I was in grade school. The sun was trapped by a leather thong. And so the animals, they're all burning up. And the beaver agrees to go chew on the thong because he's got the teeth for it. And he releases, I can't remember who trapped the sun. A leather strap. Somebody, some trickster, one of the tricksters, probably the fox. You know what it is? Oh, coyote.
Not like a thong. I'm thinking like,
coyote. No, not a bikini bottom. Okay. This is no, it's a leather strap that, what I'm saying is it's an animal's, animals saving the planet of their own. So what we're seeing here is that, it's not an allegory. It's not a story to describe the process of nature, I think is what we're getting at here, the process of winter. It's that these seem like, at least from this perspective, legendary bad things that people have done. Hermits and black magic practitioners. Think of the Skinwalker Ranch series, where you have somebody who becomes a skinwalker, must be shunned by their tribe after having done something horrible, like kill a member of the tribe. And so they go off, but they are granted evil powers. And going back to the legend of the Skinwalker, that's an evil act done by somebody who wants to practice black magic. They don't care about being a member of the tribe and being liked. They want to go off and have these superpowers of running 80 miles an hour beside tourist cars.
Yeah.
Their actions there have become legendary, but they are not indicative or describing of nature, the seasons. You know what I'm saying? It's like the Skinwalker brings the fall, and the winter comes, and because he's evil, and then once he's shooed away, the spring can come, and the summer, the leaves on the trees bloom and all that. You know what I'm getting at?
Yes.
So this is what's interesting is that I think maybe what Tess is alluding to is that maybe there were some tall, freaky, giant people that had some kind of strange armor or were able to...
Or were otherwise technologically advanced.
They knew what iron was, of course, because the Spanish showed up with it soon after 1492 to create a lot of terror and havoc and misery. So they understood the concept of iron and swords. But
but the question is, when does this myth originate? Does it predate that contact by the Spanish?
It seems to me to be that way.
Yeah.
Right. So there's something going on here. Again, what I find fascinating about the origins of myth is what sparked this. Is it just some guy, the tribal storyteller, who's just really good? He's very imaginative. Or did something weird happen and that gets transmogrified into legend and myth?
That's a real word?
Probably. Let's just move on.
Well, I've only read it in Calvin and Hobbes, so.
Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's got to be real then. Yeah, so that's an interesting concept about this particular legend, which I think we should apply this to the discussion of giants, is that maybe there were some very big people that had some kind of strange ability or, I would say technology, but some, especially the armor. And as we'll see a little later on, occasionally a little bit of cannibalism did happen.
That's going to wrap up part 2 of our series on giants. We'll be back next week with more giant talk, including our very special guest and iconic giant, Dutch actor Carl Stryken, whom you'll readily recognize from Twin Peaks, The Addams Family, and Men in Black, to name just a few of his projects. We'll be talking to him not only about what it's like to be 7 feet tall, but also what the hell is going on in Twin Peaks.
Please remember to support our sponsors. They keep the show free and the lights on in Blanket Fortiana.
Special thanks to John Bolin.
Hi, I'm Allison Sellers. I'm Allison Sellers. I'm Allison Sellers.
I'm Tess Feifel, and I give permission to Astonishing Legends to use my voice and research however they see fit future conversation.
Our show is edited by Sarah Wendell, and our theme, which is available as a ringtone, is by Judson Crane.
Sound design is by Ryan McCullough.
Special thanks to the ARC and its lead researcher, Tess Feifel.
But most importantly, we want to thank you, our listeners. Visit our store at astonishinglegends.com or interact with us and other listeners on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
You can also find us at patreon.com/astonishinglegends if you'd like to support the show in that way. Copyright Astonishing Legends Productions.
Good night.